film opens with Charles Farmer dressed in a spacesuit, riding his horse across the open fields. Upon arriving home, he finds his wife, Audrey, has made pancakes. However, their daughters, Sunshine and Stanley, aren't too thrilled and refuse to eat, saying they look like Jupiter with rings around them. Charles asks where their son Shepard is, and Audrey explains that he's still in bed. Charles heads to Shepard's space-themed bedroom, filled with old photos of his past. He gently wakes him up, and Shepard, who's been working on a project, stirs. Shepard mentions he received an email from someone offering to talk about fuel for their spaceship and suggests a meetup. As it turns out, Charles once served as an Air Force pilot and was on the path to becoming an astronaut. But circumstances changed, and he left to take over the family ranch in Texas after his father's death. So Charles is now running the family ranch in a small town where everyone knows everyone. He hasn't abandoned his lifelong goal of going to space. In his barn, he's been building a replica of an old spacecraft. Later on, Charles drops Audrey off at her job at a local coffee shop. Some regulars there tease Charles about his plan to launch a rocket. They joke it will either never happen or blow up, but Audrey brushes off their comments. Meanwhile, Charles visits his daughter's classroom to talk about his spacesuit. The kids are eager and full of the question. After the session, the teacher praises Charles for being a great dad who's willing to be silly to spark the children's imagination, saying many parents just dress as clowns. You've raised the bar with that suit. The teacher adds, "Thank you for that. Have a nice day." Following that, Charles meets the person Shepard contacted online. This person offers to sell them fuel. Charles asks for 10,000 pounds of it, which takes the guy by surprise. "Are you really planning to launch a rocket?" "Yeah, you're kidding, right?" No, Charles soon learns that the cost of the fuel and delivery is way beyond what he can afford. Realizing he doesn't have enough money, he heads to the bank to ask for a loan to cover the expenses. Despite being an old friend, the banker refuses his request, saying, "People around here think you're out of your mind." He goes on to admit, "That rocket of yours is impressive, but as a friend, I have to tell you, it might be time to let it go." Charles still has existing debt, and if he doesn't pay it off soon, the bank could seize his farm. Half of these debts were inherited from his father, along with the ranch. "I took on most of that debt from my dad," Charles explains, "and the bank expects you to pay it back." The banker responds later, "At home during dinner, his daughters talk about space and say prayers for their aspirations." Afterward, Charles takes his girls into the spacecraft and they chat about the stars. Audrey remains supportive of her husband's dream. That night, she notices that Charles has lost his wedding ring. He admits he left it somewhere in the spacecraft. The next morning, Audrey's father, Hal, visits them. Charles proudly shows him how far he's come with the rocket. Hal is supportive as well. But their conversation is cut short when the mailman arrives with a letter from the bank. The letter informs Charles that he has 30 days to settle his debts or face losing his home. Furious Charles storms into the bank, wrapping the letter around a brick and hurling it into the loan officer's office. This creates a big commotion, and even the sheriff has to step in. "Mom, what's going on? Kid, how's your dad doing? He's waiting for you. You need a ride." "No, I'm good. Follow me." They head to see the judge. Arnold presents the brick that was thrown at him. The judge simply tells Charles to apologize to the loan officer. "Just say you're sorry, Arnold." "I'm sorry." Then the judge asks Arnold to step out so he can have a private talk with Charles. "Assume the position. You're not really going to hit me with that thing, are you? Come on, I've known you forever." The judge, worried about Charles's situation, insists he see a psychiatrist, hinting at concerns about his mental state. The only psychiatrist in town is Beth Good, a former classmate of Charles, who now works at the local school. While waiting for his turn, Charles strikes up a conversation with a kid sitting nearby. "What did they get you for? Sleeping in class. You a broken window." When Beth talks to Charles, she tells him to give up on his space ambitions, thinking he's stuck in the past and needs to move on. Strangely enough, she flirts with him as she says this, making the session awkward. After the session, Charles heads to Shepard's classroom, interrupting the lesson. "I could use someone like you at the house," he tells his son. The teacher tries to continue with the history class, but Charles interrupts, declaring that his kids will learn to make their own history. He then takes the kids home, informing them that they'll now be part of his space project. He briefs them on their new schedule. Later, Audrey arrives home with her co-worker Phyllis, concerned that the kids aren't at school. Charles reassures her, explaining that they'll only miss 5 weeks and will return after that. He adds that every morning they'll have regular lessons, so they won't fall behind when they return to school. Do you know what Shepard's science teacher told him? Get this. She said, "Science isn't sexy. Do you really want your daughters to only know when Mercury's in retrograde?" Meanwhile, the FBI gets wind of Charles's attempt to buy a massive amount of rocket fuel and shows up at the farm. They find Charles in the warehouse with Hal and start investigating the entire property. They eventually discover the rocket Charles has been building and are stunned by its sheer size. As the FBI agents continue to search the farm, they begin to suspect that maybe Charles isn't planning a space launch at all. Instead, they wonder if he's constructing a weapon. "How do we know you're not making a warhead?" "Because I'm not at war. Due to their suspicions, they inform Charles that he won't be allowed to launch the rocket until they can figure things out. Charles then meets with his lawyer, who tells him that they submitted the FAA application months ago, complete with flight plans and detailed designs of the rocket, but no one ever responded to deny the launch. The lawyer explains that the authorities didn't take Charles seriously. At the time, he also mentions a friend in Manhattan who specializes in handling these types of cases. The following day, Charles's story becomes headline news, with media outlets from around the world covering it. News reports in various languages talk about the former Air Force pilot with a degree in aerospace engineering. Charles's lawyer calls, saying he sent a contact from CNN to help protect him from the FBI's growing interest. Holy cow. Munchak, you didn't tell me your friend was with CNN. Suddenly, Charles is famous with people across the globe talking about his story. A crowd gathers outside his barn, eager to catch a glimpse of the rocket. Soon, 2 FBI agents are assigned to monitor Charles around the clock. The FBI agents are nervous that with all the media attention, they'll end up looking bad. We're gonna look like fools. Their conversation is interrupted by a phone call. She wants an autograph. Meanwhile, back in town, people who used to mock Charles's dream have now done a complete 180. They fully support him and rally behind the rocket, which has become a source of pride for their small community. The rocket itself is massive, impressing everyone who sees it. Realizing that Charles's application to the FAA wasn't just a joke, that the agency now takes his project very seriously, determined to prevent him from launching, they pull some strings and influence the media. Soon newspapers start publishing negative articles labeling Charles and his family as antisocial or even suggesting they're from another planet. Audrey is frustrated by the rumors and suggests they set the record straight, but Charles believes it's better to let their actions speak louder than words. They decide to go to a local carnival to unwind. The press follows them everywhere, filming their every move. While at the carnival, Charles's old military buddy, Colonel Masterson, shows up. They all sit down for dinner together, and Colonel Masterson compliments Audrey on her cooking. He shares the stories from his experience flying the shuttle, and the group jokes around trying to come up with a name for Charles's rocket. Everyone tosses out suggestions, but one of Charles's workers writes down La Otra, which means the other woman in Spanish, and they all agree on the name. After dinner, Charles gives Colonel Masterson a tour of the rocket and the control room he's been building. Although impressed, the colonel isn't entirely convinced the rocket will fly. He also expresses doubt that the FAA will ever approve it. Then out of nowhere, the colonel drops a major revelation. The colonel reveals that the authorities won't allow an ordinary person to go to space and urges Charles to give up on his dreams. He then presents Charles with a tempting offer, a guaranteed trip to space through official channels with a seat on a shuttle. Charles quickly realizes that the colonel has been sent to convince him not to launch his rocket. The colonel explains that the top brass are afraid Charles might embarrass them with his homemade rockets, which could disrupt the trillion-dollar space industry. Determined to stop Charles, they start throwing obstacle after obstacle in his way. They impose countless regulations, making it incredibly difficult for him to proceed. Soon, the FAA, FBI, CIA, Department of Energy, and military officials all gather to review Charles's case. They argue that no civilian should be allowed to build such a large rocket because of the potential to weaponize it. Meanwhile, Audrey gets an unexpected visit from a woman with Child Protective Services. The woman accuses Audrey of letting Charles brainwash both her and the kids, claiming that he has cut them off from the outside world. She warns Audrey that if she doesn't take control of her family, she risks losing her parental rights. While all this is happening, Charles delivers an impassioned speech about the value of holding onto a dream and fighting for it. The FAA chairman tells Charles that they'll notify him of their decision. After the hearing, the head of the FAA corners Charles in the restroom and threatens him. However, Charles's lawyer overhears and reassures him that it's all a bluff. They have no legal grounds to stop him yet. Their tactics are just meant to intimidate him. In fact, Charles muses they seem awfully skilled at crushing people with dreams later. Audrey goes to the grocery store and feels like everyone is staring at her. When she tries to pay, the cashier informs her that her card has been declined, forcing her to leave without the groceries. Concerned, Audrey heads to the bank only to learn that they're about to seize their house and all the farm equipment. That night, tensions flare between Audrey and Charles during dinner. Audrey accuses him of hiding his financial troubles, including multiple overdue payments. The next day, while the rest of the family goes to church, Hal and Charles watch a car race. Hal notes how companies spend big money just to plaster their logos on cars driving in circles. This sparks an idea in Charles. He uses his newfound fame to approach various companies, pitching the idea of advertising on his rocket. Unfortunately, they all turn him down, fearing the negative impact if the mission fails and he dies. Later that day, Charles returns home with gifts from those same companies. However, the joy is cut short when they find that Hal has passed away. The family mourns his loss and holds a quiet funeral. One evening, Charles spots a man on the farm counting his cattle. Farmer approaches the man and asks what he's doing. The man tells him he's appraising the land for the bank. Using the FAA's tactics, Charles threatens the man to back off. Later that evening, Charles comes up with a plan to make his own fuel by mixing kerosene and hydrazine. He asks his son to adjust the rocket engine so it can run on the new fuel. Soon after, his lawyer visits and informs him that the committee wants 60 days to make a decision. Charles, frustrated, replies that he doesn't have 60 days since the bank is going to foreclose in just a week. The lawyer explains that delaying the process is part of the FAA's. That night, Charles has a heart-to-heart conversation with Audrey. He reveals that his father's dream was to own a farm. It was his life's purpose. When his father learned the bank was going to take the farm due to unpaid debts, he tragically took his own life. Charles confesses that he feels he might do the same if the FAA crushes his dreams. The next morning, Audrey wakes up to find a farewell letter from Charles. Suddenly, a huge blast shakes the house, shattering the windows. Audrey rushes outside with their son and sees the rocket attempting to take off. Unbeknownst to them, Charles is already inside the cockpit preparing for launch. The rocket lifts a few meters but quickly crashes back down. Sliding into the distance, Audrey and the kids jump in the car and race to rescue Charles, who is badly injured. He nearly dies from head trauma and other wounds. After being thrown from the capsule, they rush him to the hospital, where Audrey pleads with him not to leave them. Meanwhile, public interest in Charles' story fades, but 2 FBI agents are still assigned to watch over him and his family. The FAA uses this moment to publicly declare that this is exactly why civilians can't be allowed to build their own rockets. As Charles slowly recovers over the next few months, the weight of his failed project begins to take its toll on him. He asks Audrey to help take the rocket's remains to the junkyard, but she refuses. Later, Audrey meets with her lawyer and learns about an inheritance from her late father. He had left 3 trust funds for their children and a significant amount in assets and stocks. Audrey heads to the bank with plans to pay off all their debts. However, Arnie's comments about her husband's crazy space dream make her reconsider. Instead of paying off the debts, she decides to give the money to Charles. Audrey motivates him by reminding him that their children had grown up believing in the dream of launching that rocket. Without it, they would be just another dysfunctional family. Inspired by her words, the family begins rebuilding the rocket, and Charles trains himself for space. Eventually, they complete their dream rocket, naming it the Dreamer. Charles tells Audrey that no matter what happens, his children will know their father never gave up, and that thought alone makes him happy. He recalls how his own father gave up on life, and he refuses to do the same. Meanwhile, the FBI catches wind of Charles buying more fuel and rushes to stop him. While saying goodbye to his family, Charles orchestrates a distraction. One of his workers drives a truck to mislead the authorities. The FBI intercepts the truck, only to realize it's a decoy. Now, feeling humiliated, they continue their pursuit. Charles climbs into the cockpit of the rocket, and Audrey, along with their children, manage the control room. As the FBI races to reach the farm, the rocket successfully takes off before they can intervene. Shepard leads the mission, and everyone in town, including the officials, watches in awe as Charles finally launches into space. All of Charles's friends are thrilled to see his success, including Colonel Masterson. News outlets everywhere are covering the launch, celebrating Charles Farmer's achievement. However, some officials deny the launch ever happened. As Charles orbits Earth, he plans to circle the planet 9 times, marveling at the breathtaking view. He becomes emotional, shedding tears of joy. But things take a turn when he loses communication with his family, which leaves them terrified. Meanwhile, the FAA holds a press conference, continuing to deny that Charles launched his rocket back on Earth. Shepard quickly calculates that Charles will run out of oxygen if he doesn't fix the electrical system in time. While floating in zero gravity, Charles notices his wedding ring, which gives him a clue about the disconnected cables. With that hint, he finds the problem and fixes the issue, re-establishing contact with Shepard. After completing the planned orbits, Shepard sets the coordinates for Charles's descent back to Earth. As Charles prepares for re-entry, he shares a nostalgic thought. "I think I'm going to miss the backyard." Charles' family rushes to the designated landing site to pick him up, and he safely touches down. They bring him home, where the film ends with an interview on a popular American talk show. The host humorously comments on how most men struggle to get a motorcycle past their wives, jokingly asking how Charles managed to get a rocket instead. Among the audience, the 2 FBI agents are seen applauding his accomplishment. In the closing remarks, Charles asks, "How many dreams do you think have been destroyed by bureaucracy and paperwork? Maybe we could have had more talented scientists and entrepreneurs." The video ends with a call to action for viewers to subscribe and check out more recaps on the channel.